What would the 2026 Senate map look like if Kamala Harris was currently president? That's what we're going to talk about in today's video, and we're going to talk specifically about some of the key states that would decide Senate majority after the 2026 midterms if Kamala Harris was currently serving as president, if this was a Kamala Harris midterm instead of a Donald Trump midterm. So with all of that said, I want to start by talking about states that I consider safe Democrat and safe Republican states in a matchup such as this. So states like Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, Illinois are going to be labeled as states that I would consider safe states for Democrats. These are states that I think that Democrats have good nominees, have good background in, able to win these pretty strong. We're going to do a similar situation on the Republican side. And you'll notice that this becomes significantly different when we talk about certain states that otherwise throughout my predictions we've talked about as maybe safer states for Republicans across the board. But in this prediction, since we're looking at Kamala Harris as the current incumbent president, this changes the trajectory of things very, very quickly and makes states that otherwise, such as Kansas or maybe even Nebraska, Mississippi is in that as well, makes these states safe Republican, because this is going to be a much more Republican wave year than a Democratic wave year in this certain hypothetical matchup. So with that said, these are the states that I would consider safe Republican states that are going to vote in favor of Republicans by over 15% on the statewide level. With that said, I want to move over to likely Democrat and likely Republican states, starting with the state of Minnesota. I still think Democrats perform well here. I think that we're still in a likely territory across the board, over 5% in the state of Minnesota. Similar situation in Virginia. Also think Democrats perform well here. Depending, of course, on the nominee. If Glenn Youngkin had decided to run for the Senate seat in this hypothetical, he might have performed better. But for this sake, Mark Warner is facing someone who isn't very well known across the state of Virginia, and ultimately, I would say that this is still a likely Democratic state in this specific matchup. That said, I want to move over to New Hampshire. Still think this is a likely Democratic state. Think they performed well in the state of New Hampshire. I don't think that would really change much. Think Democrats overwhelmingly would probably perform well here as well. That said, I want to move over to likely Republican states. These are going to include Iowa, Ohio, and South Carolina. Yes, Ohio would vote for Republicans overwhelmingly in this hypothetical because Republicans are the party out of power in this certain hypothetical. They don't have the presidency. People would be looking at Kamala Harris at the state of the economy. This specific hypothetical has Ohio in that likely Republican column. Of course, I do think that it could be slightly closer given Sherrod Brown running, but I just think that if we're talking about a scenario where Kamala Harris is the president, it's hard to see a world where Republicans don't win across the state of Ohio. Could be wrong on my margin of likely, maybe need to move it to lean, but this certain prediction, I'm going to have it in likely. South Carolina, the only reason this isn't safe is because of what has happened with Senator Lindsey Graham. And I also don't think that specifically South Carolina has a really fantastic candidate in a Republican. Annie Andrews is, a strong Democrat, but not strong enough to win this state, and certainly not in a Kamala Harris midterm election. So that said, South Carolina as well, Florida as well, also going to go in that likely Republican column, over 5% in this current prediction. The hard thing about Texas is that if it wasn't Ken Paxton, I certainly think this is a likely Republican state. But given the fact that this is Ken Paxton running, and I'm going to stick to the fact that it would be the same nominees, even though that is that would be a very wild statement. I don't think that there would be the same nominees in some of these states if Kamala Harris was currently president. But for this matchup, I'm going to stick with that, so I'm going to keep Texas off of this for now. But just keep in mind, otherwise, this would be a likely Republican state for Republicans across the state of Texas as well. That said, I'm going to move now into, let me double check, actually Alaska. I also think Alaska would be a likely Republican state in this column as well. Kamala Harris, current president, like we've discussed already. The state of the economy, people are putting blame on Democrats instead of Republicans overall. which would land Republicans performing better in this midterm cycle. So with that said, I want to move over and talk about lean Republican and lean Democratic states. So I'm going to start with the state of Texas. Like we talked about already, I think that in this specific matchup, only because Ken Paxton is the Republican nominee, would not perform as well. Overall, Republicans still win the state of Texas in a lean margin if Ken Paxton's the nominee, likely if it's not Ken Paxton, given Kamala Harris. Again, Kamala Harris is president, state of the economy, people are putting blame on her. It's going to put a significant impact on Republicans turning out to the polls and voting against the Democratic administration. This isn't going to be a 2022 reset. If you remember back in 2022, Democrats performed well despite the fact that President Biden was disapproved of and such. But that was mainly because of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Kamala Harris isn't going to have that in her column in this midterm cycle. So ultimately, Republicans are going to perform a lot better here. Another state that's going to go in that in the lean column, it's going to be the state of North Carolina. Now, this is hard because Roy Cooper is such a fantastic candidate across the state of North Carolina, but in a Republican environment, Republicans win. Republicans win this race. Ted Budd was not the strongest candidate across the state of North Carolina back in 2022, still won. Michael Whatley is not the strongest candidate across the state of North Carolina, but in this matchup, I just have to believe that Republicans would perform well here and win the state, especially, again, given the stakes of this election, given the fact that this would be a Republican environment. Republicans would win across the state of North Carolina. And with that said, I want to move over to the state of Maine. A lot of people are talking about this race in 2026, and I still think that it's going to be close. I still think Susan Collins has a chance to pull something off here. And I think giving past polling, she may just do that. And in a 2026 matchup where Kamala Harris is president, she certainly is going to win. That's going to be a lean Republican state for Susan Collins across the state of Maine. And this brings Republicans to a situation where they've won every state that they already had. Democrats still have Michigan and Georgia to try and hold on to. The state of Michigan, with Abdul Al-Sayed and Mike Rogers running against each other, Mike Rogers wins this state. And I think it's going to be a lean Republican state as well. I think across the state of Michigan, voters would approve of Mike Rogers because of how close he got in 2024. He was so close to winning this race across the state of Michigan. And in a Republican environment where Kamala Harris is president and she, again, likely would be disapproved of and ultimately have a negative midterm cycle on her, Mike Rogers wins in the state of Michigan. And I think that there's a lot of factors that go into this, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, there is a proven track record for Mike Rogers. He's came really close to winning Michigan. And against a candidate like Abdul Al-Sayed, who doesn't say he's a Democratic socialist, but certainly is a progressive Democrat across the state of Michigan, who's already proved that he can't perform as well as polls predicted in a primary, I think Mike Rogers pulls this off in the state of Michigan in that lean Republican column. And the final state's the state of Georgia. And I think this one's difficult only because Jon Ossoff ran a fantastic campaign this cycle that I think, overall he's expected to win. But in an environment like this, things change. Of course, Jon Ossoff may be really approved of, but Kamala Harris is disapproved of. Are Republicans going to be more motivated to turn out and vote against the Democratic Party in an environment where Kamala Harris is currently president? That's just the question. The question overall is yes. The answer is yes to that question, because Republicans are going to turn out in an environment like this. Democrats are going to be saying, oh, we already have the presidency. There's not such a need that we turn out. There are going to be, of course, tons of Democrats that turn out to the polls and vote, but will it be enough to counter the Republican effect that would be that of a Kamala Harris presidency? That's just the question. So finally, the state of Georgia, one of the most difficult states to predict, but I actually think, given the fact that back in 2022, this race was won by the Democratic Party, I think 2026 is slightly different, and I ultimately think Republicans win this, but I mean narrowly. Tilt Republican column for the Republican Party here in the state of Georgia. Now, this is my final matchup where Republicans have 55 seats, Democrats have 45. But the thing to keep in mind here too is the fact that a lot of these races would have been significantly different also back in 2024, the class of senators that were up back in 2024, if Kamala Harris had won on the statewide level. Michigan would have been a better Democratic state than it already was. Pennsylvania likely wouldn't have flipped. So we would have had a different style of midterm back in 2026 than we would today. There would be a chance that we would be talking about maybe a 54-46 seat majority instead. West Virginia was an automatic flip. Ohio could have stayed in the Democratic column if, and simply if, John Husted, well, not John Husted, but if the Republicans had performed well across the state of Ohio in 2024, if they hadn't performed well across the state, it could have helped Sherrod Brown ultimately win this race in a matchup where Kamala Harris is president. So there's a lot that plays into this is what I'm trying to get to, and it's really hard to predict how this would go and if this would actually be the Senate majority. But in a sake where 2024 was the exact same other than Kamala Harris winning, and 2026 is similar candidates, if not the same candidates, this is the final match. Republicans 55 seats, Democrats 45. So with that all said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys agree or disagree with any of my characterizations? I love reading through your thoughts and replying to you guys and seeing where you guys stand as well. If you haven't already, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys again so much for watching.